Ecuadorian authorities confirmed the first protest-related death as thousands of indigenous people marched to the capital. A key witness in the murder trial of U.S. police officer Amber Geiger has been shot dead. Kosovo holds parliamentary elections for the fourth time since its independence from Serbia. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Camila Escalante. We begin in Ecuador, where the first related death to the ongoing nationwide protests has been confirmed. The provincial government of Azuay has confirmed that Raul Chipe was run over by a vehicle around noon on Sunday while participating in the Indigenous blockade on a highway between the cities of Cuenca with Guayaquil. According to authorities, the incident happened after a vehicle tried to force its way through the blockade, hitting several protesters on its way. The nationwide protest against the recently announced austerity measures in Ecuador has entered into its fifth day. Following violent repression from security forces, the National Indigenous Organization has also declared its own state of exception, as thousands continue marching to Quito. In a statement, CONAI said that the state of exception is a response to the violent attacks that police and military forces have carried out against indigenous protesters. It covers indigenous territories, and any military or police officer who enters without an authorization will be detained. A military unit in the Chimborazo province and another in the Cotopaxi province have already been detained. Meanwhile, a total blockage of roads have been reported in provinces with the largest percentage of indigenous population, such as Cotopaxi, Imbabura, and Chimborazo.
We are the ones who are losing with this crisis, with this rise that the nefarious government has done. We do not agree with it. Until they repeal it, we will have to take these measures, and we will go to the last consequences.
Russian Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Borisov met with Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro to deepen bilateral relations, especially in the area of oil, agriculture, and military sectors.
We have reviewed all the issues, and we can say there are new economic ventures with technology sharing, participation of Russian companies in all areas of the strategic production of the country. We have renewed and advanced tremendously throughout the oil, gas, and basic businesses.
Indigenous delegations from several pan-Amazonian countries have gathered in Rome ahead of a synod on the Amazon by Pope Francis. Indigenous leaders held a conference in Rome titled Voices of the Amazon, Land, People, and Religions, to warn the world about the threats the government of Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro poses both to indigenous peoples and the environment. The synod will see bishops from 9 pan-Amazonian countries discussing the social injustices and crimes indigenous people are facing in Latin America. And in yet another blow to Jair Bolsonaro's government, the prosecutor's office in Brazil's Minas Gerais state has filed charges against tourism minister Marcelo Antonio for allegedly embezzling public funds through fake candidates during the 2018 elections. Bolivia continues to confront issues within its own justice system, which have led to impunity in cases of femicide. Details in this report.
1 out of every 10 cases of femicide that reach judicial stages ended in sentencing in the last 6 years. There is widespread indignation about the delay in justice.
These cases can be prioritized to once get a sentence that is as fair as possible. We will not allow further delay. Our judges are committed to see these cases developed with absolute speed.
We have not made this work visible to you, out of respect for the rights which the victim has in any case, but nevertheless the work is incessant, constant and permanent.
In this country, there is a high level of concern about the wave of femicide, which is growing every year, despite the advanced legislation enforced to address the problem of violence.
There are 9 rapes a day in the country. 9 acts of sexual violence, of which 4 are against girls and 5 against teenagers and women. That figure is dramatic because if we understand violence in a structural logic, we are realizing that the issue of femicide is a sign, but behind that, we have a series of other acts of violence.
A legislative commission has the mission of clarifying, in 3 months' time, the delay of justice when it comes to acts of femicide. With the proliferation of reports of violence that it receives, such as rape, it clarified that it cannot cover such a broad issue.
This commission is formed exclusively until the month of December. The objective is to identify the difficulties that are occurring, the bottleneck, the problems that exist in the process of femicide.
Another commission, created by the executive branch, supervises each of the processes presented to the judiciary. It is intended that at least 80% of the lawsuits will end in judgment before the end of the year. This country's law imposes the maximum penalty of 30 years in prison, without the right to pardon, for the crime of femicide.
We'll take a short break now, but when we come back in Iraq, the death toll climbs to over 100 during the clashes between police forces and protesters. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back. In the United States, a key witness in the trial of former police officer Amber Geiger has been killed just days after Geiger was convicted of murdering Botham Jean. Joshua Brown died in hospital after being shot multiple times by an unknown gunman on Friday in a Dallas parking lot. Brown was a key witness in the murder trial of Geiger, a white police officer who was sentenced to 10 years in prison on Wednesday by a Texas jury for murdering her neighbor, Botham Jean, a 26-year-old black accountant, in 2018. 5 days of clashes between Iraqi police forces and protesters have claimed over 100 lives and left more than 6,000 wounded. The Iraq government faces one of its biggest challenges since it took power a year ago, as protesters continue to express public anger over corruption and unemployment. The oil-producing country has struggled to rebuild after the invasion by a United States-led coalition that overthrew the government of Saddam Hussein in 2003.
We will start with the statistics. These statistics are accurate and in coordination with the Ministry of Health, which were communicating with us throughout. The number of injured is 6,107, and the number of martyrs, 104. These numbers include security forces, civilians, and protesters.
Polling stations have closed in Tunisia for parliamentary elections. According to the election observers, the turnout was generally low, though the election was considered peaceful. More than 1,500 lists and 1,500 candidates were running for over 200 seats. The election comes weeks after the first round of presidential elections, where 2 independent candidates gathered most of the votes. The presidential election runoff will take place on October 13th.
Compared to the first results of the presidential elections, we feel that there is the same trend. We feel that there is a wind of change in this country.
Meanwhile, the wife of jailed Tunisian President Nabil Karoui has called for the release of her husband ahead of the runoff vote this Sunday. Karoui was arrested in August for tax fraud and money laundering charges, but was allowed to continue with his candidacy.
We are still proceeding with the elections and the democratic process, but I'm very sad because these elections passed with great sorrow for me, my husband, and for his party. There was no fairness in opportunity and participation, so it is really a very sad day for Tunisia.
Voting has also wrapped up in Kosovo for the 4th parliamentary election since the country declared its independence from Serbia in 2008. The elections were called after Prime Minister Ramush Haradinaj was resigned in July over war crime allegations. The new leadership will be expected to broker a peace deal with Serbia, which still rejects the independence of its former province and thus blocks Kosovo's United Nations application.
Oh, this is a very important election for Kosovo because it determines the future of the young population, one, and the future of the young state of Kosovo too. So it's kind of very important to do in both sides. We need more freedom, we need more rule of law, we need more prosperity, we need more development in economics, and so maybe the vote will be counted toward that.
Demonstrators have rallied in Yemen's port city of Hodeida to protest against the Saudi-led blockade. Protesters gathered outside of the United Nations headquarters, waving Yemeni flags and chanting anti-Saudi slogans. The Saudi-led coalition reportedly seized ships carrying oil, food, and medical supplies, heading to Houthi-controlled territory. The standoff between the two sides worsened following drone attacks on Saudi oil facilities in September, which led coalition forces launching a military operation north of Hodeida. 10 people have been injured after a grenade exploded in Kashmir's northern city of Anantnag. The blast is reported to have taken place near a government office. This is the first attack to take place at a government building since India's crackdown on the region. People in Kashmir have been protesting in India since India stripped the Muslim-majority region of its autonomy in early August. Kashmir is divided between India and Pakistan, who both claim the territory.
Today around 10:30 in the morning, terrorists lobbed a grenade in the Lal Chowk area of Anantnag city, which is a very busy area, due to which 10 people got injured, of which 1 is a constable of traffic police and 9 are civilians.
Relations have been strained between South Africa and Nigeria after the recent xenophobic attacks. The reprisals from Nigeria didn't make it any better. The recent state visit by Nigerian president to South Africa has helped set the record straight, but both countries already have connections that won't be broken, even by violence. Our correspondent Matuba Matlaje explores what South Africans love about Nigeria.
Leaders of Africa's top economies say they want to work together to end xenophobic violence that almost derailed the ties between the two nations. But South Africa and Nigeria have been speaking the universal language to each other, even amid the tensions we've seen in recent days. Music produced in Nigeria has had a major impact on South Africa's music playlists.
So we are here in Garankuwa, where we've seen shops owned by migrants being targeted during the xenophobic violence. But we're here for a different reason now, to find out why local people love Nigerian music. And I've got my dancing shoes on. Let's go.
DJ Percy Sledge is the morning drive show host for the local radio station with a big following from young people.
As radio presenters and also artists to make sure we unite Africans, the music, the kind of music that we play on air, and also making sure whenever leaders also want like the xenophobic attacks, we condemn such things on air.
A few kilometers away from Garankuwa, there is another township, Soshanguve. Reports of xenophobia have been reported here too. Popular DJ who goes by the name of DJ Madness says sometimes it's not xenophobia.
It's more of ignorance than xenophobia, in my opinion. You know, people are very misinformed. I think the problem is that there's too much fake news, you know, social media is contributing to that. Things go viral, things get out of hand, things get blown out of proportion, you know.
Xenophobia is undisputed and it's happening in South Africa, but why do we love Nigerian music so much?
Their dance hall, man, it has that thing, man, you know, especially at their accent, the way they pronounce words, you know. So yeah, man, it has that thing, man, which makes us fall in love with them and also their music.
In the last 3 years, I'd say they're responding well to Davido and as well as Burna Boy. But what I've also noticed is that they also respond to the collaborations that we have with them. For example, the biggest song by AKA Fela and Versace, it was very huge, and because it had the Nigerian influence, you know what I mean?
While the political leadership is important in restoring stability, it's also important to put the finger on the pulse of what ordinary people feel at the worst of times. Matiba Mahlachi for Telesur in Soshanguve, South Africa.
We'll take a short break now. After that, we'll be joined by Drew Garvey, who's running for the Communist Party of Canada, with insights about the upcoming federal elections. Join us again after this. Welcome back. Canada will head to elections on October 21st to elect members of Parliament and the office of Prime Minister. A federal leaders debate will be held on Monday with the participation of 6 candidates. In attendance will be the usual suspects, as well as the candidate for the newly created People's Party of Canada, Max Bernier. His party has no seats in Parliament, but will participate ripe with right-wing talking points on immigration, privatization, and cuts to public spending. Meanwhile, Jagmeet Singh is seen as a main contender against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Western countries 3 times higher than the U.S.
Joining us now for some insight into how things are looking in Canada, we have Drew Garvey in Toronto. Drew is a candidate for the Communist Party of Canada running against incumbent Member of Parliament Chrystia Freeland, who's of course Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Great to see you, Drew.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me.
Now let's start with the blackface brownface episode, which provoked a great deal of conversation and commentary about how Trudeau's costume is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this government's imperialist crimes.
Yes, that's true. The revelations that Trudeau made several racist portrayals of racialized people by dressing up, for a number of years, stretching over a 10-year period, made quite an impression on the voting public in Canada this election. But what is not really, unfortunately, part of the conversation across Canada is Canada's foreign policy and the need for a real foreign policy of peace and disarmament, which is one of the main reasons we, the Communist Party, decided to run in the riding of Chrystia Freeland. And those crimes are many, like you said. For example, this was on a band of troops. Canadian troops are now in Mali, in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in Iraq. So this is an expansion and a deepening of Canada's imperialist role around the world. And of course, Canada's leading role that they're playing in the regime change efforts in Venezuela, selling arms to the Middle East, and also trying to work with Trump to isolate China and also attacking Russia.
As you said, Drew, Chrystia Freeland and Trudeau have led the charge against Venezuela's democratically elected government. They're pouring a great deal of effort into this so-called Lima group and putting money into what amounts to coup efforts. How do Canadians feel about the incessant involvement of their government in the sovereign affairs of another country and the sanctions which are being imposed?
Yes, well, it is ironic. Chrystia Freeland has gone on and on about how, like other countries, that Russia or China or even Venezuela might threaten this election in Canada. But it's actually Chrystia Freeland and the Trudeau government that have played a leading role in trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. In 2017, it was Canada that rounded up the right-wing governments in the hemisphere in order to bring them into the Lima group, which is outside of a group of nations outside of any internationally recognized group of nations. And it included some of the worst human rights defenders in the region, including Colombia, which murders social movement leaders on a regular basis, Honduras, which is also had a stolen election right in 2017. And there's massive social movements trying to recall the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez. So Chrystia Freeland rounded them all up and then gave full support to Juan Guaido after trying to doing her best to sabotage the election in Venezuela, including not allowing Venezuelan Canadians to vote in Canada. And she's been a leading mouthpiece, doing, sitting right next to Bolsonaro, the fascist president of Brazil, and calling with a straight face for the overthrow of President Maduro. So it's blatant hypocrisy, and the only way to explain it is her close proximity to the White House and to Washington, and also because of Canadian business interests in the region, especially mining, which we can see unfolding right now with Canadian company Crystal X on the verge of potentially getting assets that were stripped from the Venezuelan government in the United States. Billions of dollars will end up in Canadian corporate coffers as a result of Canada's support for this coup attempt.
And back to the election, Drew, we'll always hear these arguments that a vote for a small party like the Communist Party of Canada, it constitutes vote splitting, taking support away from candidates in the NDP. And Jagmeet Singh, what does your party say about the kind of social democracy the New Democrats or the Green Party are offering?
Well, we see the main enemy as the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, which if the Conservative Party manages to form a majority government again, would be even worse for this country. And it would probably continue Chrystia Freeland's warmongering around the world. But in terms of the NDP and the Greens, we see a need to exist and run and get votes. This is because, take, for example, foreign policy. The NDP and the Greens do not have a consistent foreign policy of peace and disarmament. In fact, the NDP has voted for several NATO wars. They have said terrible things in support of regime change in Venezuela and waffled. The leader, Jagmeet Singh, waffled during the coup attempt that Canada was supporting. So we need a clear voice to call for peace and disarmament. And in the short term, getting rid of Chrystia Freeland and the Liberals would be a good thing. But in the long term, we need much more fundamental change. We need to get at the roots of Canada's foreign policy of imperialism, and that includes getting rid of corporate power. Corporate power is the root of imperialism. So the only party that's really advancing a new system along those lines is the Communist Party of Canada.
And we can't talk about Canada without discussing Indigenous sovereignty. What does the Communist Party of Canada have to offer in terms of that?
Trudeau was elected in 2015, promising a new nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people. But at the end of the day, it's been more of the same. And most Canadians, and especially Indigenous peoples, recognize this. The most telling, two telling examples of this were the buying of the Kinder Morgan pipeline in order to force it through, despite protests of many First Nations along the route, and also the invasion of the Unistoten camp and the forcing through a pipeline on Wet'suwet'en territory earlier this year. So those were stark examples, but fundamentally there has not been a change in terms of the genocidal policy of the Canadian state. There remains a suicide crisis on reserves. There remain boil water advisories. So what the Communist Party calls for is the immediate introduction of the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples into legislation in Canada. And the most important part of this is the right to veto development that affects First Nations land. And this is a step towards real self-determination and sovereignty of Indigenous nations in this country. And it's something that the Liberals and the Conservatives say is not necessary, which is ridiculous. Fundamentally, we see Canada as a multinational state, and we need a new equal and voluntary partnership of First Nations, of English Canada, of Quebec, of Acadians, and we need a new constitution based on equality of these nations if we're going to live together on this land. And right now, it's just more of the same old oppression from Ottawa.
Short on time, Drew, but one last question. The NDP famously took out the word socialist from its party constitution under former leader Thomas Mulcair just a few years back. Does the Communist Party of Canada intend to remove communist from its name anytime soon?
No, we're proud of being communists, despite the history of the Cold War that has left a bad taste in some people's mouths. But there's more and more Canadians that are open to these ideas because they see the system isn't working for them. In fact, a recent poll showed a majority of Canadians were in favor of socialism, and more people are turning towards our party. So no, we're going to be consistent and hold on to our principles.
Thank you so much, Drew. We've been speaking to Drew Garvey. He's a candidate running for Member of Parliament in the same riding as Chrystia Freeland in Toronto, Canada.
Thank you.
Come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at teleusenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telus English, I'm Camila Escalante. Thanks for watching.